Now to Colombia, where a political outsider appears headed for a slim victory in the South American country's presidential election. Abelardo de la Espriella, a right-wing lawyer who has been backed by U.S. President Donald Trump, Espriella declared victory after winning some 50% of the vote, only slightly ahead of leftist Senator Ivan Cepeda, who took nearly 49%.
Jubilation in the northern city of Barranquilla. Supporters of Abelardo de la Espriella have been cheering his narrow election victory.
The Colombian people have entrusted me with the supreme honor of serving them as the next president of the Republic of Colombia.
With nearly all the votes counted, de la Espriella maintained a 1% lead. His supporters are hopeful he'll crack down on crime and turn around Colombia's struggling economy.
We are happy because change is truly coming. Change for this country, change for children, for families, for business owners, and for young people. This is the government we need.
De la Espriella, who has no previous political experience, ran a populist campaign. He's vowed to build more prisons and crack down on drug traffickers. He's also threatened to investigate his political opponents. His rival, leftist Senator Ivan Cepeda, has filed a complaint over alleged voting irregularities. He also said he would wait for a full review of the vote.
We recognize the preliminary vote count conducted tonight as data that is neither official nor binding.
Cepeda has called for calm after his supporters took to the streets to protest those tallies. The win for de la Espriella would return Colombia to conservative rule after 4 years under leftist President Gustavo Petro.
Let's bring in Ivan Briscoe here. He's Senior Director for Policy at the International Crisis Group and an expert on Latin America. Good to have you with us. Ivan, the preliminary results from Colombia's election show it was narrowly won by Abelardo de la Espriella. Tell us about him. What does he represent? What should Colombians expect from him?
Well, I think until a few months ago, he was mainly known in the law courts of Colombia and the United States. He's been a lawyer for a number of years. He's defended some fairly well-known figures, shady figures from Colombia. He's also been a businessman. He's originally from the Atlantic coast, so the Caribbean coastal area of the country, and he's exploded onto the political scene really as an outsider candidate, so coming from the right, but competing with the more traditional right-wing parties with a message which has all been about thoroughgoing reform to the state, a merciless fight against criminal armed groups in the country, lowering taxes and enabling everyone to make their way towards a more successful business, and greater income. So those are the promises that he has made, and he has scored a really quite surprising victory from the point of view of what the race was looking out like a few weeks ago.
Well, this has been a hard-fought election, and the preliminary result was extremely tight. We're talking about only around 1 percentage point difference. What does that tell us about the country, this close result? What does it tell us about the country politically?
Well, I think most Colombians recognize that the country is extremely polarized. This has actually been the case for a number of years. We famously saw a plebiscite on the peace accord in 2016, which was again divided the country almost in two. Colombians seem to be split between the half of the country which is most concerned about inequality, about the lack of opportunity for mobility, poverty, and wants to see the state doing more, providing more public services, being more effective. On the other side, there is a firmly conservative outlook, which has got many adherents, particularly in the wealthier parts of the country, which sees the state as effectively corrupt, political elites as parasites, and believes that there is a firm hand involving the military, which is needed to clamp down on the organized crime and the armed groups, which have really afflicted Colombia for decades now, and particularly most infamously drug trafficking.
What would you say are the main challenges that Colombia's next government will have to tackle quickly in order to gain legitimacy with the electorate and stay in office?
I mean, there are no simple problems which need to be solved, which will suddenly mean that the next government is extremely popular. Colombia is a complex country with many regional differences and many challenges which it faces. Obviously, the first I've already mentioned is insecurity. Colombia has been affected by a civil war since the 1960s. Its largest guerrilla was demobilized a few years ago, but there are now many smaller armed groups, up to 30,000 people in arms across the country, involved in a wide range of criminal rackets, from drug trafficking to extortion to illegal mining. And levels of violence, unfortunately, have got worse in certain conflict-affected areas over recent years. And that will be a problem which will, of course, be intensified by US demands that Colombia come down hard against the cultivation of coca, which is used to produce cocaine, which has grown to the highest levels ever seen in history. But then, of course, as I said, there are the economic problems. There is the inequality. Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It takes generations for someone to work themselves up from the poorest parts of a society towards a middle class position. This inequality is lived and breathed by people across the country, particularly in the largest cities. And it's a demand that we've seen has generated huge waves of protest against governments in the past. And if Abelardo moves on his plan to cut 40% of state spending, I think we could start to see similar protests coming up in the next months or years. And aside from that, there's the bigger problem, of course, of the relationship with the United States.
Latin American expert Ivan Briscoe there.
Elizabeth Dickinson is Deputy Director for Latin America at the International Crisis Group. That's an NGO that conducts research and analysis on global conflict and crises. She joins us from the Colombian capital, Bogota. Welcome to DW. One of the decisive issues in this election was the outgoing president's Total Peace campaign. Just explain to us what it was and why it was so central to this campaign.
Well, Colombia has really for many years been locked in a debate about how best to address the situation of fragmented and criminalized conflict that has emerged really over the last decade in the wake of the demobilization of a former insurgency that laid down arms in 2016. And I think that we've seen basically two stories out there about how best to do this. That of the outgoing president, Gustavo Petro, was to rely on negotiations and dialogue as a means to dismantle these organizations. What the incoming and apparent president-elect Abelardo de la Espriella has promised is a more hard-handed crackdown. And I think that debate about how best to tackle the security situation really became acute in the months before this election. It's important to remember that the electoral campaign in Colombia actually began with the assassination of a political candidate who was a pre-candidate for the presidency, Miguel Uribe, in broad daylight in Bogota. So security was certainly on the top of voters' minds. And of course, any outgoing president, faces in the electoral process, really a referendum on how well they did regarding key issues on voters' minds.
Okay, and it was very close. It's been very close. De la Espriella campaigned on this tough on crime platform. What changed on the ground in Colombia over the last 4 years that seems to have made that message just edge out the competition?
Well, really, again, dating back to a decade and certainly accelerating over the last 4 years, we have seen an expansion of the presence of armed and criminal groups
Right.
across Colombia, particularly in certain pockets. In rural areas, we're talking about groups that are engaged in activities such as illegal mining, drug trafficking. But in cities too, I think voters have started to feel that the rural conflict has encroached upon security within the cities in issues like extortion and robberies. And certainly a part of the population was seeking a stronger hand against that situation, which is causing very real concerns for communities and civilians.
So will a presidency led by Espriella, is that going to mean negotiations with armed conflicts are scaled back and abandoned? Are we going to see more hardline crackdowns?
Well, it's interesting because I do think that one thing is to be the candidate and another is to be president. Colombia has never militarily defeated an armed or criminal group in the more than half-century history that it has in combating illegal organizations that are involved in illicit economies. There simply isn't a military solution to a lot of these organizations that have set up shop and essentially govern some remote areas of the country where they are the ones who are imposing rules, who are collecting extortion or sort of taxes, really governing economic life and frankly providing opportunity to those who are members of the organization. So what we believe is that there will be a necessity at some point to combine military pressure, which does play a key role, with some sort of dialogue with these organizations to find an off-ramp. It's worth remembering as well that many of the combatants of these organizations are very young, including children. We've seen a rapid expansion in child recruitment into these groups in many years. So we're talking also about minors who are 14, 15, 16 years old and need a credible pathway back to civilian life.
This election has been extremely close with less than a percentage point between the leading candidates. What does that tell us about where Colombia is now?
I think that the closeness of the election is really a wake-up call to both sides about the deep level of polarization in the country and the traumatic wounds that have been opened during this campaign. Colombia has been divided for some time on both social policies, economic policies, and also, again, on this issue of how to address the conflict. The message really to the winner is that they will have to find a path forward to reconcile these very deeply divided parts of Colombian society. This is not a mandate for extreme policies. This is a mandate for reconciliation and a way to, look for a middle way. We were encouraged by the tone of the candidates on both sides last night after the initial count came out, promising to govern for all Colombians in the part of the Espriella, and certainly also calling for calm among supporters of the outgoing president Gustavo Petro and his supported candidate Ivan Cepeda.
Good talking to you. Thanks for guiding us through that. Elizabeth Dickinson from the International Crisis Group.
Thanks very much.